return to the lockdowns and to a theme I've heard you say in other public appearances about fear caused by the lockdowns and essentially a policy of fear of the disease. So one of the things that struck me during the epidemic is how the public health agencies in implementing the lockdown have used this fear. The fear was not just an accidental byproduct of the facts of the epidemic. The facts of the epidemic, as you say, and the disease, you say, are in line with many other diseases we face in terms of the harm. But in fact, there was a policy decision by governments to create fear, essentially to induce compliance with lockdowns. I read an article in the Telegraph, and the main point of it was that in the UK, there's a scientist on a committee that encouraged the use of fear to control behavior during the pandemic. It admitted that its work was unethical and totalitarian. And this is the committee, this is the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, which is a subgroup of SAGE. They expressed regret about the tactics, and in particular about the use of psychology as a way to control the population. Is it reasonable for governments to cause fear and panic in service of a good cause, disease control? Or is this an unethical totalitarian action that should not have been done?
I think that the first duty of any government in dealing with any issue whatever is objectivity and truth. There are no circumstances in which I would accept it is legitimate for governments to lie, and in the category of lies I would include distortions of the truth and exaggerations. I think there are circumstances, mainly concerned with defence, in which it is legitimate for governments not to disclose things, but the active falsification of facts is never forgivable. In this country, there was a notorious memorandum produced by the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, immediately before the lockdown on the 22nd of March, in which basically what this committee of SAGE said was, we've got a problem here, which is that this is an epidemic which is selective. A lot of people will feel that there's no reason for them to be alarmed because they are young and have good underlying health. We've got to deal with this. So what we need is a hard-hitting emotional campaign, that's actually what the words that they used, to persuade everybody that they're at risk. Now that, to my mind, is a lie. It's a program for the deliberate distortion of people's judgments by pretending that the epidemic is other than it is. Before the lockdown, the Chief Medical Officer in the United Kingdom gave a number of very straightforward, perfectly balanced statements about what the risks of the epidemic were, who was primarily at risk, and what the symptoms were in different categories, and made the point that in fact there was no need for alarm except among certain people whose interests clearly had to be carefully protected. All of that stopped with the lockdown. Before the lockdown, SAGE had advised consistently along two particular lines. First of all, they said, you've got to trust people and carry them with you. So no coercion. Secondly, they said that one should try to ensure that life is as normal as possible, except for people who particularly need protection. That had been the basis of planning for this pandemic, which had been in place since 2011 in this country. It was also the basis initially of the World Health Organization's advice, and it was the basis on which highly respected health institutes like the Robert Koch Institute in Germany had advised their governments. Now, all of that went out the window in the course of March 2020. Nobody has ever identified any specifically scientific reason why this advice, which was carefully considered, should suddenly have been regarded as inappropriate. Indeed, they shied away from the subject altogether. It was a very odd state of affairs. The reasons for the change were not scientific. They were essentially political. People who have a high degree of confidence in government as the safeguard against every misfortune said, look what they are doing in China, in Italy, in Spain, in France. The government is taking action there. This is very manly and admirable of them. Why are we not doing the same? People who see abrasive action being taken elsewhere tend to say, well, look, action is always better than inaction. Why aren't we getting on with it? This is essentially a political argument. It's not a scientific one, but it was decisive. In this country, Professor Neil Ferguson, responsible for some of the most doom-laden statistical prophecies which have been issued at any time in any country about the pandemic, most of which have been found to be exaggerated, gave a most revealing interview to a national newspaper in which he said, well, we never really thought about lockdowns because we never imagined that it was possible. We thought this was unthinkable. And then China did it. And then Italy did it. And we realized we could get away with it. That's almost a quote. Now, actually, the reasons why we did not behave like China before March 2020 were not just pragmatic reasons. It wasn't that we thought it wouldn't work. The reasons were essentially moral. These were fundamentally contrary to the whole ethos on which our societies are built. There is absolutely no recognition in people who speak like Professor Ferguson spoke in that interview, no recognition of the fact that we have moral reasons for not behaving in a despotic fashion, for not wishing to be like China, even if it works. Well, now there are disputes about whether it does work, but even if it works, there are moral limits, and they have been transgressed in a really big way in the course of this crisis. The result has been that what began as a public health crisis is still a public health crisis, but it's an economic crisis, an educational crisis, a moral crisis, and a social crisis on top of that. The last four aspects of this crisis, which are much the worst aspects, are entirely man-made.
I mean, striking to me